to the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel and chapter 30. And we want to read verses 1 through 6 to begin. And this is kind of our subject text this evening. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and had smitten Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. And David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives were taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. Now I want us to look at this evening. There's a lesson and encouragement for us in this. And especially where it says here in verse 6, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. I think somebody during the conference had mentioned that, and that the word there meant to harden. And so our topic this evening, the title of our message is Developing Hardness. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is encouraging and instructing Timothy. And in verse 3, he says, "Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier. If a man also strive for masteries, yet is he not crowned, except he strive lawfully. The husband that laboreth must first be partaker of the fruits. Consider what I say, and the Lord give thee understanding in all things." So we see verse 3 here, Paul admonishes Timothy that in this work, in serving the Lord, we need to be tough. He says, and Paul is comparing here to being a soldier. And soldiers develop a toughness because of what they're going to have to do. And so that's one of the things that boot camp does and things like that. It begins to condition them and toughen them up, harden them, because of the things that they will be forced to do, and the things that they will have to endure in just carrying out that service as a soldier if called upon. And David right now is in a position of leading soldiers, if you will. And so, as we think of David and what he says here, and this was the same word, actually, that was used in Exodus when it's talking about Pharaoh, how he hardened his heart. Of course, now Pharaoh was hardening his heart against the Lord. Here, David is hardening his heart, if you will, or toughening himself up in the Lord. And so this is a lesson that we as God's people need to learn. And part of this, we need to, as we think about this, in order to persevere, to endure, we need to kind of get tough, become hard in some things. And so I want us to think a little bit about David's situation. You know, we're kind of jumping into the middle of something. And to understand, how did David and these men get where they are right now? And it goes back, if you go back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 11 through 13, we see where Samuel anoints David king over Israel. It wasn't part of the message, but I was kind of commenting how that David's older brothers, how they were kind of envious, and so they took every opportunity they could to kind of put David down. He was the baby. And yet God had passed over all them, all these big, strong, tall, muscular, handsome guys, and the Lord passed over all of them and went for their baby brother, David, and anointed him king over Israel. And so he's gone from being the shepherd boy and being anointed king. And then in chapter 17, we read this is where he came into the camp and heard Goliath. And so David goes out and slays Goliath. Boy, you think, man, you know, here is someone that God has put his hands upon him and is bringing up, has anointed him to become king over Israel. He goes up against this giant. Everybody was afraid of Goliath, and he goes up against him and slays him. And so Saul brings him into his own household, and David becomes a kind of a captain here. He goes in and out with the armies. But then that's chapter 18, verses 5 through 7. Let's look back there. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 5. It said, "And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tabrets and with joy, and instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Here Saul was the king. David was this young boy that Saul has taken under his wing and has placed him over the armies and all. But now David's getting more praise than Saul. Verse 8, Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed the thousands, and what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. From that moment on, something changed in Saul's attitude toward David. So David still rises there, but as a result of this, in chapters 18, 19, 20, 21, all account how David then has to flee from Saul. Saul wants to kill him. Saul pursues after him. And David is wandering around outside the main areas of Israel there, even at times living among the Philistines and different ones to stay away from Saul. He becomes a fugitive as Saul seeks to destroy him. In 1 Samuel 22, he comes to the cave of Adullam. Verse 1, 1 Samuel 22, 1. David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontent, gathered themselves unto him. And he became a captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. So he kind of becomes like a Robin Hood in the sense that he become a fugitive. and others that are driven out by Saul or whatever, his brethren, they come to him, they gather to him there in this cave, and he becomes a captain over them. And we see later this number grows from 400 up to 600. And so, 1 Samuel 25:1, we see Samuel dies. He was the last of the judges. He is the one who had anointed David. He dies. And then in 1 Samuel 27, he seeks refuge amongst the Philistines. Now, how ironic. His rise, if you will, to fame was over defeating the Philistines and the slaying of Goliath. And now he's fleeing from Saul, and he turns to the Philistines for protection. 1 Samuel 27, verses 1 through 6, and David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me, to seek me no more in any coast of Israel. So shall I escape out of his hand. He'd been kind of in the outskirts, the remote places of Israel through this time, even defending it. While Saul is away chasing him, David is defending Israel from the marauders and different ones around. And so now he seeks to turn to the Philistines. Verse 2, David arose, and he passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achish, the son of Maok, king of Gath. And David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, even David with his two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's wife. And that was part of the story. Nabal was a wicked, stingy old man. And David had helped protect his lands and all from thieves and robbers. And he sought to help, to get some support from Nabal. And Nabal was just very churlish and rebuked him and his young men that he had sent to him. And David was angry, and he and about 400 men set out and was going to just destroy Nabal. But Nabal's wife, Abigail, when she heard of it, the servants told her what had happened. And she runs out to meet David, and she brings supplies and things to David and basically intercedes. And said, don't do this. When you come become king, you don't want to look back on this and have blood on your hands and regret your actions here. And she interceded on behalf of her husband. And David accepted that and turned away and went back. But then later when she revealed to Nabal what she had done, he gets so upset and angry that it says he became a stone, and about 10 days later he died. And so then David, remembering her kindness and everything, he takes her to be his wife. So when it mentions that she was Nabal's wife, it's just, this is where she had come from, and it reminds you of that story. But her husband had died before this. Nevertheless, we see here that here he had 600 men, but it wasn't just 600 men. It was their families and whatever things that they possessed and carried with them that he was responsible for. And so it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him. And David said unto Achish, if I have now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? Then Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Wherefore Ziklag pertaineth unto the kings of Judah unto this day. And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months. So that's how David and all of his followers, with all their wives and children and the things they possessed, come to live in this Philistine city of Ziklag. And when the Philistines had risen up, was going to go to war with Saul, and David and his men was going to go with the Philistines. But the princes of Philistines wouldn't hear of it. They didn't want David and his men in amongst them when they went to war with Israel. And the king apologized to David. David said, "What's the matter? What have I done to offend?" And the king said, "Nothing. You have behaved yourself perfectly the whole time you've been in our midst. You've done nothing." He said, "But the other princes, they just won't hear of it." He said, "Just go back home." Well, in the meantime, while they had left Ziklag with the men of war, the Amalekites had come in and had taken Ziklag. They had burned it and carried everybody off. And so as David and his men are returning then, that's when they discover Ziklag has been burned, and all their wives and children are gone. And so when we think about this, how David had started to rise, and then this, what we would say, reversal of fortunes. He'd become a fugitive. He was hated of Saul. He was pursued. He lived in the wilderness and was just, trying to exist off the kindness of those that would support him. These other people had come to him, and it was during this time that Saul pursued him twice, that he had opportunity to kill Saul and didn't, and so on. And now this. And so it was at this time that it fell to this place. And I point this out to show that in our life as Christians, especially when the Lord saves us, and we're so happy and so full of zeal and so on fire for the Lord, and things at first begin to go well for us. Then there are times, things don't go well. It's not all a mountaintop experience. There's not always the times of blessing, and sometimes there's a lot of hardships, a lot of sorrow and grief that may come our way and enter into our lives. There are times when we as believers face disappointments and failures in our lives, even to the point of despair and giving up. And we see even David's own men who had rallied to him and had followed him. He said they were ready to stone him just because of the grief that they were suffering at that point. And so there may come times in our lives when we reach a point like this, and there's just so much disappointment, so much despair. Galatians 6:9 admonishes us and reminds us, let us not be weary in well-doing. Let us not become faint in doing what's right, in serving the Lord. Sometimes it seems like, you're serving the Lord, you're trying to serve the Lord, you're trying to do the right thing, and bad things are happening. Now, the Lord has those times in our lives for a reason. These things happened to David for a reason. And David was being, you don't go from keeping sheep to sitting in the palace and ruling over the nation. There's some steps in between. And this was one of those steps that David had to take. There's lessons to be learned. And between the time when the Lord saves us and we enter into the glory of heaven and our rewards, there are some things we need to learn. God is out to mature us. And this is part of the maturing process. This was part of David's maturing process. And he admonishes us here, don't be faint. Don't become so weary that you faint, that you give up. He says here, for in due season we shall reap, if we faint not. That's the reason God admonishes over and over. There's a reference to the fact, he that endures to the end shall be saved. We're to persevere. Now we believe that in the preservation that God keeps us. He enables us to persevere. We're kept by the power of God through faith. But we have a responsibility to persevere. And what he's saying is, do not give in to circumstances. You know, if you just look at his circumstances, they were so bad. And there was so much sorrow and grief at this moment that most people would give up. But we see what David did here. He said the first thing he did was he encouraged himself in the Lord his God. You know, it wasn't where somebody, one of the men came up to him and said, David, you need to man up. David basically told himself that. Because his friends was ready to stone him. They weren't ready to tell him to man up. They was ready to stone him. You know, there comes a time when we need to just draw aside with God, just you and God, and toughen our heart, our resolve. I like that one song that we sang, you know, I am resolved. And that's what this is talking about. He was toughening and strengthening, hardening his resolve to follow the Lord. That's what he's talking about. He encouraged himself in the Lord. He strengthened himself. He hardened himself in the Lord his God. Perhaps he had to go back to that time and think about, you know, God, through Samuel, had chosen him and separated him and anointed him to become king. What does the scripture say? He which hath begun a good work in you will finish it. I think part of what David was reminding himself here is God is not finished with me yet. Because that which he had promised to do, he hasn't done yet. And so sometimes we need to encourage ourselves with that idea. God's not finished with me yet. I don't care what the circumstances may be. I don't care how low you feel, how impossible things may appear to be. God is not finished yet. And so we can take that and strengthen ourselves and strengthen our resolve to keep on keeping on. And so when he had strengthened himself in the Lord, what did he do? He inquired of the Lord, Lord, what would you have me do? That's the next thing he did. Very next verse, verse 7. David said to Abiathar the priest, even one of the priests had come with David. When Saul turned against the priests because they helped David, Abiathar escaped and he came to David. So there was even a priest living with him amongst the other fugitives there. I guess it's kind of like Friar Tuck. That was... You take that analogy of Robin Hood. This was kind of their Friar Tuck. Now he was the priest, Ahimelech's son, He said, I pray thee, bring me thither the ephod. And Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David. And David acquired at the Lord. He strengthened himself in the Lord. Now it says he inquired himself at the Lord. He came to God and he's asking God, should I pursue him? And if I pursue him, will I overtake him? And God spoke to him and he answered him, pursue. And he didn't just say pursue, he said, for thou shalt surely overtake them. And not only will you overtake them. See, David only asked, should I pursue them or not? Should I pursue after this truth? Shall I overtake them? Those are the two questions David asked. God gave him three answers. Pursue, you will surely overtake them. And without fail recover all. Now think about that. You'll recover all. Sometimes we look at our circumstances and we try to encourage ourselves. And Lord, what would you have me to do? What can I do? And the Lord reveals to us and tells us something. This is what I want you to do. And we just, I'm just too weak. I can't do that. David, verse 9. Look at this. Verse 6, David encouraged himself in the Lord. Verses 7 and 8, David inquired of the Lord. And verse 9, so David went. That is, as God had told him and promised him, so David obeyed. He went. He said, should I pursue? God says, pursue. And so he went. It seems simple when we read it, but there's a lot more to it, I think, when we consider human nature, when we consider the weakness of the flesh, when we consider how devastating circumstances can be sometimes. This is quite an accomplishment. But nothing's too hard for God. Jesus, he's talking about the salvation of men. He said, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And not only does that pertain to salvation, but there's a lot of things that with men these things are impossible, but with God all things are possible. The Apostle Paul said there in Philippians that my God can supply all of our needs. My God, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So when we go back to he strengthened himself in the Lord. He encouraged himself in the Lord. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He said earlier in Philippians, for it is God who works in us both to will and to do of his good pleasure. And so when David went, he wasn't going in his own strength. He was going in God's strength because God had promised. And so I say that we need to be encouraged in this ourselves. But in David, there's a great example to us how to conduct ourselves, how to proceed when we find ourselves in circumstances. In the days ahead, I don't know. Maybe you've never had a point in your life where you just felt like that, where you felt so overwhelmed and just in despair and to the point of giving up on life. But should that day come, then remember how David behaved, but in him is an example to each one of us as a believer. Because what David did is really what God did through David. And what God did through David, He can do through each of us. And we need to, and as such then, He is an example to each of us for what God can do. And so we see he went. He endeavored. You know, he encouraged himself. He inquired of the Lord. Now we see he endeavored. He went to do that which the Lord had told him to do. And he went because God said. He said, pursue them, because you will overtake them and you will recover all. And so we see here that in this action and in this promise of God lay all their hope, all their expectations, all their future blessings and benefits was in them going. As we said, you know, God had set David aside and had anointed him to become king. And so everything that entailed was hinged here upon him pursuing. He put all of his hope and all of his trust in that. It's bound up in that statement. And all he had to go on is God's Word. But for us, that ought to be enough. You know, 2 Peter 1:4. Well, notice verse 3. According as His divine power hath given unto us all things that pertain unto life and godliness, through the knowledge of Him that has called us to glory and virtue, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these, that is by these promises and our claiming of these promises, ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Great and precious, exceeding great and precious promises. You know, as God's people, that is what He has given to us. And so we see verse 17 that David did overtake and he smote the Amalekites. That is, he overtook them and he engaged them in battle and he defeated them. And verse 18, and David recovered all. Isn't that exactly what God said? And without fail, recover all. Verse 18, and David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away. And David rescued his 2 wives. And there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. See, when God says all, He means all. He said there wasn't anything missing. He recovered all. And when God makes us a promise, and we, in faith, believe and act on that promise, it will come to pass just as God said. We can count on that. We can believe that. And so there's a number of things that proceed after this. But what a great victory. What a time of rejoicing. Can you imagine the reunion now between these men and their wives and their sons and their daughters? And to realize that all their stuff, everything, all the spoil, everything that pertained to them was there. Not only that, but there was a lot of spoil because Ziklag was kind of the last town taken. There was raided other areas too. And it carried off much spoil. And we see David here begins, well, he had been, but we see again, it kind of comes out as you read and study this, how he acted the part of a king. Now, he's not really a king. I mean, he'd been anointed by Saul way back. But he's been a fugitive. And he was kind of the leader of this ragtag bunch of 600 men. But he behaved himself as a king. As they had pursued after the Amalekites and they crossed this one river, there was about 200 out of the 600 that was just too faint from the journey. I mean, they must have been pushing hard. You know, they'd come back to the town, they'd found it destroyed and everything gone. They had wept until there wasn't any strength left in them to weep anymore before they began their pursuit. So you can imagine how, if you've ever been grieving over something, you know how weak that makes you, physically weak. And then to take out and pursue, and there was about 200 out of the 600 that just was too weak to keep going. And so they was left behind. It was 400. Well, that 400 wanted to keep all the spoil for themselves, and David said no. He said, verse 23, Then said David, Ye shall not do so, my brethren, with that which the Lord hath given us, who hath preserved us and delivered the company that came against us into our hand. For who will hearken unto you in this matter? But as his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarried by the stuff. They shall part alike. Was it Romans 15:1? You know, the strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak. You know, just because they were too weak to pursue. But some of the wives and children belonged to them too. That was some of their stuff too. Said they stayed behind with our stuff, what we had with us, and we pursued on. And so those that go into the battle will share alike with those who stay behind with the stuff. And notice verse 25, and it was so from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel unto this day. So he was acting a king, wasn't he? He wasn't king yet, but he's behaving himself as a king. You know, and that's what we need to do at all times. It doesn't matter what our circumstances are. We're a child of God. We're a child of the King. And God has said we will rule and reign upon this earth. And we need to conduct ourselves as such in this world. Behaving ourselves in such a way as to bring honor and glory upon the Lord who has saved us, whose we are, to whom we belong. And so as we fall down through there, what a time of rejoicing, what a time of celebration. But David's life's not over yet. You know, this was just a stepping stone in his life. One more experience, one more victory. That's the way our lives are. You know, we face some kind of adversity, and we strengthen ourselves in the Lord, and He leads us through it, and He gives us the victory over it and the power to overcome, and it's just one more victory. And then we move on to the next. There are more occasions for celebration in David's life. He goes on then, Saul is slain in the battle with the Philistines. And at first only Judah anoints him as king. And he goes up to Jerusalem, which was still a city of the Jebusites. Actually, the name of the city at that time was Jerusalem. Salem meaning peace, but it was the city of the Jebusites. And David took Jerusalem and made that his capital, and it became known as the city of David. And that became his capital, and then eventually Israel comes and anoints him king and receives him as king over all Israel, just as God had said. And then we see when they bring the ark into Jerusalem, into the city of David, and he's rejoicing. So there are many other occasions, and there's other adversities, there's other problems in David's life, and the Lord brings him through all of them. There were failures, there were victories. And that's our lives. But there's a great lesson in this, as I said, and we need to take David's example here. And whenever we face some adversity, no matter what the circumstances may be, we need to take that time and just draw near to God. I remember and it seems, looking back on it, it seems almost a silly thing. But at the time, it was quite serious to me. I was in high school, and I just hadn't been saved long, was going to Bryan Station, and I was kind of dating one of the deacon's daughters. And I remember as driving up Bryan Avenue, or Bryan Station Road, coming up to this light, the traffic light at New Circle Road there, heading in toward Lexington. And being in the traffic there, and I remember kind of asking myself, thinking to myself, why are you so faithful in attending church? Is it because you really love the Lord? Or is it because of your girlfriend? That's a lot of people go to a church because they have a boyfriend or girlfriend there. And so I was questioning myself, why? Well, right after that, she broke up with me. And I was devastated. And at times it was hard for me to go to church. I'd go and see her sitting with somebody else. I'd see these other couples, or his husbands and wives. It looked like everywhere I turned I saw couples. And it reminded me that I wasn't a couple anymore. And it was hard. But I remember also then thinking to myself, well, you really need the Lord to get through this. And He's in church. You're not going to get close to the Lord. You're not going to get strength from Him if you lay out of church. We need to strengthen ourselves in the Lord. Well, obviously I got through it. Like I said, it seems like a little thing. The Lord had something better for me. Well, He did. And so, it's those things sometimes we think, well, man, I'm just devastated. I can't go on. The Lord has something better. And when you look back at it, and what seemed like such a terrible time, almost nothing. But it was a big deal at that moment in time for me. God in His mercy and His grace, He had more in store for me. And so there's been a lot of ups and downs since then. And I dare say there will be more until the Lord comes back. But they're all intended for our learning, to help mature us, and to prepare us. When the Lord saves us, He doesn't take us immediately into heaven. He leaves us here. Part of that is so that we can be a witness. But part of that is too that we learn that new man that is created in you when you're saved. And that new man is the one that's going to inherit, that has inherited eternal life. That new man is the one that will live throughout all eternity. But he's still in the flesh. And that new man is a babe. And that new man has to mature. And so the Lord is maturing us through our experiences in this life, that we learn more fully of His ways and fellowship with Him and learning to trust Him. And hopefully when the time comes and we are changed and we have our glorified bodies and we go up to meet with the Lord, for that new man, it won't be that much of a change. As we step out of this body and into our glorified body. Now that body's going to be real different. But for that new man that is created in us, our life experiences. And I'll tell you something else. The more I think about it. You know, especially when we're saved and we're young. And we look and we think, well, we got all this life ahead of us. We have all these expectations and things we want to do. We're not ready to turn loose of this life yet. The older you get and the more you struggle with sin, and the more of the wickedness that you see going on around you in the world, the more you realize how you don't really fit into this world, the more ready you are for the Lord to come back and take you home. I tell you what, you know, there's a lot of examples and things in the Scriptures. Reading about Lot's wife, now she looked back. Her heart was still in Sodom and Gomorrah. As wicked as it was, that's where her treasures were. And she looked back. And I tell you what, I believe that the child of God, when he's brought through these things and the Lord comes, we'll be ready to leave. More and more is that we set our heart and our affections on things in heaven rather than things here upon the earth. And that takes some, that takes some experience. That takes some time to wean us away from the flesh, to wean us away from the things of this earth, to teach us and for us to truly, the young person can hear it and acknowledge it, but to really prefer and set our affections on the heavenly things and things above rather than the things of this earth, that takes a maturing. And that's what God's doing for us. And that's for our learning, for our admonition, for our benefit. So when He comes, and He comes near and He calls us by name, and we're going up to meet Him, Lord willing, we won't be looking back at anything here on the earth. We'll just be looking up to Him. Keep on keeping on. Persevere. Developing a hardness, a toughness toward the things of this world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, toward the circumstances and everything else, and drawing closer and strengthening ourselves in the Lord. That's what we need to be about. That's what we need to do. Sometimes it'll take circumstances to accomplish that. And God will supply those circumstances as needed. Well, reading the Scripture, we know that one of the things that we need in order to endure is patience. The Lord knows that in order for us to develop patience, tribulation worketh patience. Therefore, He will supply those tribulations. But it'll be controlled to teach us patience. He will use those circumstances, and they'll be controlled to teach us to draw near to Him, to strengthen ourselves in the Lord, and to harden ourselves toward the circumstances and the things of this world. And to keep on keeping on. And to pursue when He says pursue. To inquire of Him. And to pursue and to endure and to keep on until the final victory. Jesus already won the victory. You know, when God told Him, you pursue them, you will overtake them, and you'll recover all. The victory, in essence, was already won. Our victory has already been won. We will enter into that victory one day. Let us stand.